Well, hello and welcome. Thanks for joining this week's panel conversation. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. We have three leaders in law enforcement that are going to be sharing their perspectives around how they go about engaging with their community and their residents, businesses, and stakeholders, and what role that has in impacting the work that they do in the law enforcement departments that they lead in their communities. We've been doing these panel conversations for some time, and the whole idea is to simply share ideas and perspectives of what's working with other communities, so that in the work that you're doing, or simply knowing or understanding what's going on in local law enforcement, you've got a better understanding, a better perspective as to how engagement works, so that it leads to higher, better quality of lives in the places where you live and work. My name is Matt Fulton. I'm the Vice President for National Engagement for a company called Polco. We work with a lot of communities, spending a lot of time right now with police departments around helping them to get a good sense for where their residents are around local police services. It's been such a challenging time over the last couple of years in all aspects of community life, but particularly in the law enforcement world, that getting the understanding of where your community is around law enforcement and learning where resident expectations and priorities are just becomes such an important part of how communities thrive and move forward. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have with these three leaders. Here's how the day is going to progress. I'll do a quick introduction of the panelists, and then we will kick into asking the panelists three questions. And at the end of the three questions, and we'll do a little round robin of the questions, we'll have an opportunity for additional comments or additional shared conversations between the panelists. It goes pretty smooth. It generally takes about an hour if I do my job well at facilitating. And they historically have been very helpful and very informative, and I hope that you find it to be the same case today. So with that, let me go ahead and start making some introductions. Christopher Workman's been the Chief of Police for Cheswold, Delaware Police Department since 2013. He began his law enforcement career as a part-time police officer back in March of 1999 for the Parkside Police Department in Parkside, Pennsylvania. One of the unique aspects that Christopher brings to the meeting is his work. He's got historical work in the fire department as a full-time fire department firefighter. He's a certified instructor for the Delaware Council on Police Training and is currently a member of the FBI LEADA team, IACP, the IACP Small Department Section, the Alumni for National Law Enforcement Leadership in Violence Against Women. He's also involved in the Delaware Police Chiefs Council and is the first vice chair for the Delaware Police Chiefs Foundation. Chief Workman, thank you for joining. Would you mind just adding a little bit to your background?
Thank you, sir. I think recently a lot of this stuff is, as I'm getting older here and have been doing this a while, of gauging more towards training and leadership training for small departments. So I have a big part in FBI LEADA and also am the training coordinator and conference coordinator for a group called SIRLEA, which is the Small and Rural Law Enforcement Executives Association, which has just kind of started up across the nation. So we're trying to get that going, and that provides free training to any law enforcement officer or law enforcement officer student. So we're working on that right now.
Well, that's great. You got a broad range of involvements in law enforcement industry. So really appreciate you taking a little bit of time to share your perspectives here.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the invite.
Chief Kenton Buckner was sworn in as the Chief of Police for the Syracuse Police Department in November 30th of 2018. Prior to being in Syracuse, he was the chief for the Little Rock Police Department. He began his law enforcement career back in 1993 and served 21 years for the Louisville Metro Police Department, where he rose through the ranks to become the assistant chief before he retired in 2014. Chief Buckner is a strong proponent of community policing and has always worked to develop a strong relationship with community stakeholders along with local, state, and federal enforcement partners. He's a graduate of the law enforcement program sponsored by the FBI, the Southern Police Institute, and the Noble Chief Executive Mentoring Program. He most recently completed the Senior Executive Program at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He's also a commissioner for the Commission on Accreditation Law Enforcement Agencies. Most of us know it as CALEA. Chief Buckner, I really appreciate you spending the time. You add a lot of value to the profession just around the whole accreditation process. So Thanks for all the work that you've done, and certainly welcome you to this panel. Can you add a little bit more to your background?
Thank you for having me, Matt. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to share and also, pick up some things that I may be able to use for our agency. I'll focus on the accreditation piece because we're actually in the process of getting the Syracuse Police Department CALIA accredited. When I arrived here in 2018, the agency had been state accredited for several years. But I think that, when we look at what we've been through over the past 24, 36 months, from protests to pandemic to now police reform, I think that there's no greater opportunity to be able to validate your police department than to have someone independently review your agency and say that you're in compliance with 21st century policing. So we've started that process to have the agency accredited through CALIA. And then this year, here actually in a couple of weeks, we'll start the clock to also have our police academy CALIA accredited, which I believe will be the second one for the state of New York, NYPD being the first. So that's kind of where we're focusing, and obviously with the police reform efforts that are going on across the country. And we certainly have those challenges that we spoke about earlier of trying to fill these holes of these the individuals who are retiring and resigning in large numbers, and trying to keep up with that has been very, very difficult.
Chief Buckner, I think you're absolutely right. And I applaud you for the accreditation process that you're going through. I think that law enforcement agencies, and we'll talk about it more during the conversation for sure, but there are so many community pressures and challenges that are testing what is the truth. And unless departments have a system in place or have an accreditation that you can rest on, the challenges only get larger for departments who aren't prepared to really provide objective data. So I'm really excited to hear your ideas and your perspectives of what's working. Congratulations on the work. I had never heard about police academies being accredited. Is that a generally new thing that's going on?
Well, for CALIA has the primary areas of accreditation for the police agency, the training academy, and then the communication center. For the city of Syracuse, our communication center is done by the county, which is the Onondaga Communication Center, and they happen to be CALIA accredited already. So that will be good for us. The three primary avenues that CALIA offers will all be CALIA accredited for our agency. So we're looking forward to that.
Well, that's very good. Congratulations on that. Let me introduce our third panelist. Ryan Monaghan currently serves as the chief of police for Tiburon, California. It's a small town located in the San Francisco Bay Area. Interestingly enough, I love this story. He began his career in public service as a seasonal employee with the San Mateo Park and Rec Department. And after briefly serving as a volunteer police cadet with San Mateo Police Department, he was hired on as a police officer back in 1994. He was promoted through the ranks to reach lieutenant, and throughout his 27-year career, he has served in a variety of special and collateral duty assignments and has worked extensively around domestic violence issues, youth service and juvenile diversion issues, and community outreach, working specifically with diverse populations. He also does some teaching at the College of San Mateo in criminal justice. Chief Monaghan, thank you for being part of this conversation. I have several colleagues of mine who started off in the park and rec world and eventually managed to find their way into the city management world. So you've kind of followed a similar path. Congratulations on that. And I'd love you to share a little bit more about your career path.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me, Matt. And I'm in great company with Commissioner Buckner and Chief Workman. Very impressive resumes with both of them. So it's a privilege to be here and to be part of this conversation. I did start out in Park and Rec as a seasonal employee, and I think that was my first real introduction to local governance, and really what I learned from that is how intertwined all these different departments are in a department in a city, and sometimes there's a tendency for the police, because of the unique challenges we have and the training requirements and all the things that you have alluded to, as well as our other panelists, to be a little bit siloed. And I think the more that you understand how these other departments work, there's a greater level of collaboration. And when you have that type of collaboration, you're just far more effective in your role. And so one of the things that I definitely try to preach in my department, being in a small town, we're heavily reliant on the other departments. So there is a good sense of synergy. And so I come in really kind of promoting that model that, hey, we are all here to serve one community, and we all have different roles in how we provide that service. But we all need each other. And so I think that really hammered that home for me, starting out in Park and Rec and then going over to the police side. And then throughout my career, especially when I formed our youth services unit in San Mateo, or had the privilege of working with a group of people to help erect that unit, we had heavy involvement from Park and Rec. And the reason being is the unit also included our Police Activities League. And our Police Activities League was a marriage between the police department and the Park and Rec department, to, where we brought their expertise in terms of programming and all the things that they do well, and then brought our expertise in terms of diversion and what youth we wanted to target in the community to get the best results. So I think that is a model to success for really any police agency, is that level of collaboration. And so it's something that I've done throughout my career. And I think it speaks well to what we're going to be talking about today.
I think that feeds really directly in line with our conversation. I totally agree with you around the integration and the importance of integrating all the departments in the whole kind of arena of public safety and the impact that all has on. Well, I tell you what, let me do this. Thanks for being here, Ryan. We're going to be talking about police needs and expectations into a community context. And as I was saying, I was a city manager for over 30 years in the Twin Cities. And I always recognize that public safety, while it's formally through the police department, public safety is something that every department gets involved with one way or another. But the leadership that you guys provide in your departments in bringing public safety into the community has such a direct impact on the overall quality of life in every aspect of the community. I tell you, I've over the course of my career, I gained such great respect for the leadership that you all bring to your departments and the role that you play. For the most part, I think people take for granted the work that police departments do in their communities until something big happens. And then depending upon the level of connectedness that you have with the community, that'll have a direct impact on how successful you are in working through whatever storm that you're working on. And if you make a mistake, those mistakes are generational. Just think of the impact on some of the communities where there have been significant police issues or significant community issues. And just the long nature of that repair or getting back those trust factors that communities simply rely on. So the role that you're playing in local government and in your communities is such a critical thing. And then you lay on top of that the other aspects of what we've all lived through, the pandemic, all of the political divisiveness, of course, all of the civil unrest that's impacted our communities in one way or another. It just has really created a challenge for law enforcement. We do, in the work that I do, we have a survey that's called the National Police Services Survey. And it's really designed to get resident input and resident perspectives around the local services, police services that they receive in their communities. The chart that I've got in front of you, we administered the survey in 2018, kind of pre-George Floyd, pre-pandemic, and then administered it again in 2020, just to kind of get a sense for what the shift in resident sentiment was around police services. And while there's a lot of things that aren't provided on this chart, what this does show is the shifts in resident priorities. Between the two surveys, school safety and security continues to be the top priority in the country across races, across incomes, across genders. And you can look at the chart and see where those priority areas are. But the one or two areas that I want to point out that actually increased over the course of the last 2 years focuses in on increasing communications or connections with the community and working with residents to solve neighborhood policies. In other words, there's an interest and a higher level of priority that's being placed on the desire to connect with law enforcement on solving the problems that are impacting the community. And so the conversation that we're having today, given all of this, the traditional difficulties in finding workable engagement strategies, especially with populations in your community that historically haven't been connected at all, this conversation becomes a really important one just to help residents and others gain a better understanding about creative ways that they can engage so that they can develop that sense of community and elevate the level of trust that they have within their own departments. So it becomes a really important conversation to have. So we're going to be talking about 3 questions. First question is, what role should the community play in guiding or influencing the delivery of local police services? The second is, what strategies do you use for managing community expectations? I've had a lot of police chiefs that say, well, once I understand them, one of the big challenges is managing those expectations because not everything can be solved overnight. So what are you doing to help manage the expectations that people are placing on the department? And then finally, what tools and methods are you using and finding successful for understanding what residents' priorities and expectations are, as well as for just simply tracking the performance that you do as a department? So with that, let's kick on to the first question. And Chief Workman, I'd like to start with you on this one. Can you talk about the role that the community should play in guiding or influencing the delivery of police services in Cheswold?
Sure, not a problem. I think one of the biggest things is every community is different, obviously. We have different makeups, we have different people. When I first came here, there was one officer working and he worked, 10 hours a day, 4 days a week. So there was very little as far as police protection came until I got here. I mean, we're up to a full-fledged police department now 24/7. But one of those biggest things that I found when I got here was we really had to learn to listen to the community and what they needed. What was their thoughts about what their police department needed to be. Once we started building the department, I think one of the biggest takeaways from that concept of community policing was that as a head of an agency, you still have to be cognizant of the concerns of that community. They're not the same as the community next to you, the community down the street. It's not a one size fits all. So I initially had to spend my time out talking to the different areas and communities to find out what was their big concerns. And having that controlled conversation, but also as we build our department, having our officers also feed into that while they're out on the streets and still engaging into that community conversation. So they bring that back to me also. I think that's one of the things that we need to do is have that open communication. That's the key ingredient, that they need to know that you're talking to you, but you're also that you're listening. That could be through, we've tried initially having surveys put out, things like that. But I found that having that personal interaction was the biggest way to solve that, bridge that gap over the last 8 years of being the chief here.
Has the community, well, I guess 2 questions. During the pandemic, did you see changing levels in the amount of participation or engagement? And
I think people were more drawn away. They were using more of the phone. See, when they call in the small towns, I mean, the other panelists should be aware of that, and I'm sure they are aware of that. When they call this department, they don't get a secretary. They get the chief of police if I'm here. They expect to have that interaction where they are talking to you directly. They're not talking to someone else. They come to my door, I answer it. So even during the pandemic, when they came to my door, I would still answer the door. It slowed a bit, but I can tell as it went on, they still continued to come or call, or even use social media such as our Facebook page and instant messaging to still get that message out and talk to us.
Engagement is kind of a universal thing, regardless of the size of agency that you're in. The way you engage might change and be different. Are your residents fairly engaged generally?
Yeah, mostly. We have we're in an area, just to put it to you, we're in an area just outside of Dover, Delaware. We have the Dover Air Force Base, which is literally 6 miles away from us. Our area is growing exponentially in our town. So we have a lot of building going up, and we get a lot of influx of people from New York and New Jersey and from Pennsylvania who are moving to Delaware because of the tax breaks. Less taxes, people are retiring and they're moving here. So we have a wide influx of different people who are used to different things, which makes that process of having to have the communication open to pretty much let them know how the things are different in Delaware as they were from where they came from. So that's one of the challenges that we find. But after after a few months, they become very comfortable with being able to have contact with us in our police department, because they're not used to that in the big cities of Philadelphia or New York or Trenton, New Jersey. So that's one of our biggest tasks here.
Yeah, no, I got you. Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Chief Buckner, can you talk about the role that the community plays in guiding the work that you do in Syracuse? Oh, I'm sorry, Chief, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So I think in addition to the good points mentioned by Chief Workman, I think in order for the relationship to be mutually beneficial, the community has to have a significant role in defining success. And when we look at when chiefs get to the end of the year, and if we've had a good year as it relates to crime, we'll be having these celebratory moments of, we had a reduction in burglary, we had a reduction in aggravated assaults. But if the community didn't define what success looked like for your agency, we'll be celebrating and they'll still be disappointed, or they'll still feel like that the police department does not serve them because the things that were important to the community were not addressed, or they were not a part of what our goals should have been. So I think that's probably the formal piece that needs to happen if you want the community to feel like that they have influence. The other part of that is, community policing is a term that's often thrown into this conversation. But if you challenge some organizations to give you tangible examples of how community policing is actually existing in your community, some people struggle to do that. We define community policing as partnerships, prevention, and problem solving. If I can't show you tangible examples of those three pillars, you probably don't have a legitimate partnership with your community. They probably don't feel like that they are included in the things that you say that are important for the organization, if you can't provide tangible examples of that. The other part is constant communication. Good or bad, I think that communication is to a relationship what oil is to a vehicle. It makes everything work better when we communicate with each other. So we have to get out in front of things when we've misstepped, and then we have to do constant communication on the things that are important to the community. Examples being our CompStat report. We post that for the community to be able to see. And we do it in a way that I always say that my aunt should be able to pick up that report and understand what crime looks like on her street. And I think if you're focusing on those things, where the people understand what you're doing, they can see the things that are important to them as a part of your goals, I think the community will remain engaged if they truly feel like that's happening in a very, I would say, valid way.
Is Syracuse a pretty engaged community generally?
Very much so. The one thing I've said about Syracuse is there are a lot of do-gooders in the city of Syracuse, which is good when you're trying to solve a problem. It can be challenging sometimes when you have people that are poking you in the side who want your time and attention. But when there are things that need to be done in our community, specifically with problem solving, there's no shortage of people or organizations who are willing to roll up their sleeves and get involved. But that also creates, to your point, expectations and accountability, because those same people who are helping you are also going to be the first ones to call you to the carpet when you've done something that's not reflective of the values that we have in our community.
I was really glad that you brought up the point of changing priorities. That the research that I brought up earlier really identified the shift in resident sentiment that have happened simply over the last 2 years. What was valid in 2018 very well may not be valid in 2020. Are there any specific examples in Syracuse that you can point to where the priorities have shifted in a way that you've had to realign your resources and approach law enforcement differently that you can think of?
Well, I will tell you that the big one is certainly in recent history been our police reform initiatives and the things that were highlighted by our community that were important, much of which, if I had to pull one word out of that entire document, it was the trust or the lack thereof. and the things that we needed to do in fully implementing our body cameras, sharing more information about the kinds of complaints that we receive, what the outcomes of those investigations are, making sure that we have programming with our youth that allows us to have constructive contact with youth and kind of get away from some of the things that we were being pushed into. The specific example of that is we became more of an occupying force in our schools rather than the constructive relationship with youth that the school resource officer program was designed for. Part of that was us pushing back on school administrators to say that there are some things that you should not be calling the police first. It's okay for us to maybe be a co-responder in this example, but we should certainly not be the front piece of responding to something that is not criminal in nature. That should be by school administrators. So once we understood kind of what our community expected from us, we began to kind of modify our operations to be more reflective of that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and makes all the sense in the world. Hey, I want to make sure I don't miss it. When you were talking about community policing, you brought up partnerships, problem solving, and I missed the third one.
Prevention.
Prevention.
And the prevention piece is most important because if I'm able to return your DVD player to you that you had stolen from your home, you appreciate that. You appreciate it a lot more if someone had never been in your house. So prevention is something that I think that is not discussed enough, and it's also difficult to measure because it's difficult to measure what didn't happen. But I think that when we can show at least an absence of crime or decrease in crime, we know that prevention is there. It's just very difficult sometimes to quantify that.
Yeah, very well said. You know, engagement kind of fits into that category. The more that you can prevent the storm by engaging more, that's a really solid preventative measure.
And I wanted to touch on that piece when we talk about the storm, and we're talking about relationships here. When you see a community to where it looks like a bomb has went off in that community as it relates to police and community relationships, the incident itself becomes the front piece, but I can assure you the pre-existing relationships before that incident determine the level of explosion in that community. And when you don't have that community fall apart.
I'm glad this is being recorded because I'm gonna capture that, continue to talk about that because you are so right. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Chief Monaghan, I'd love to hear the role that the community plays in guiding and influencing the delivery of police services in Tiburon.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Matt, obviously, right, it sounds cliche, but it's so true, right? The community is our customer. When, you look at a business model, right? How are you best connecting and serving those customers? And a lot of what we're touching on, both Chief Workman and Commissioner Buckner, is this whole idea of engagement and having that connection with your community and again, not to be cliche, but it builds trust and legitimacy. And in order for us to be effective at what we do, we need that trust and legitimacy. The community needs to know that when we're out doing some type of enforcement activity or otherwise, that there's good reason behind that. I think the other thing is realizing that every community is different. And I think Chief Workman touched on this. My community, again, is a smaller community, maybe not as small as the community that Chief Workman has, but same level of expectation. They want access to me. And I have to be able to provide that to them while at the same time kind of keep that 100,000-foot view of what's going on operationally in my organization, especially with many different changes coming down the pipeline here in the state of California in terms of police reform legislation. And making sure that my department is ready to move forward with some of that stuff. So, but there is that expectation. The community wants access. I think, and even in a bigger city, they want access to the person that leads that organization. And then within the community, right, you have sub-communities. And I think that's really important. When you define community, what does community mean, right? Well, there's the traditional sense. It's people that live together in a particular area and have similar interests. What I found coming to Tiburon is that my community's definition of what their community is was maybe different than what I expected. To them, community is not only the people that live here in town, we have a lot of people that live out of the area that bring their kids to school here in this town. So They are part of this community. We have a lot of people. This is Tiburon has a tourist population. We are a tourist site here in the peninsula. There's a lot of beauty here, and a lot of folks come to visit here. And I think that to my residents, they feel that these people that come to visit and spend time here, again, fall into that scope of community, and equally as important as our business owners and those that work here in town. And so I think that when you have to have a definition of community that's very much aligned with what your community defines as part of their community. And that was really critical for me. And I can talk more about this as we move forward. And then again, knowing that within your community you have different needs. Now, my community is predominantly Caucasian. However, we do have a small section of the community that we would say is underrepresented, right? And so how do you capture the needs and interests of those folks that are underrepresented? And that requires I think a lot more intentional work on the part of a police chief to make sure that you connect with them, because with some of those communities, there's a distrust towards law enforcement, and you have to create that relationship. So if you want to bring them to the table and you want to get their input, they have to trust that when they come to the table, they're going to be heard. And so I think that's really important. One of the things that I've done here when I started was I wanted to, and I think Chief Buckner or Commissioner Buckner really hit on this, right? Our mission, our goals, our values, we have to co-create that with the community, right? The community has to have a say in that. And because oftentimes we're not in alignment, right? What we think success is as a law enforcement agency, and Commissioner Buckner said this perfectly, may not be in alignment with what the community defines as success. So we're celebrating its success, and they don't view it that way. So I think the first step really is the co-creation of a mission statement. How do we, what are the things we're going to focus on as a law enforcement agency once we agree upon what we all want? And in most communities, right, the central agreement, I think, is we expect the police to keep us safe. How we do that is very different depending on the community. And so one of the things that we've done, and I'll talk more about this later, is we've done a intentional community engagement initiative where we're bringing different subsections of our community to the table to ask them questions. What does policing look like to you? What's successful policing look like to you? And after we meet with all these different groups, the hope is that we will be able to kind of pull out the commonalities there, and then together with the officers, and it's important to have the officers in that discussion, right? When you talk about managing expectations, because the community needs to know what the officers can and can't do and what they're capable of. And it's really important for them to hear that from the officers. So I think the goal of this program when we're done is to get all that information, and then we can actually co-create our goals and values with the community. And like I said, I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but I think, what Chief Workman and Commissioner Buckner are saying, it's hitting the nail on the head. I think we all get that.
Ryan, did you notice any changes in priorities over the last couple of years?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, with the pandemic, right, in terms of engagement, right, the community's expectation for engagement, there are a large portions of our community that are hesitant about any kind of in-person engagement. And, we thought we were coming out on the other side of this pandemic. And as we well know, there's a variant now and there's significant concerns. So I think that, even though we try to bring people together, because I think, bringing people together to have dialogue is really important. And sometimes technology can prohibit some of that more free flow dialogue that you would have if you were sitting across the table from somebody. But realizing that, in order to capture that community, we also need to get those folks in the community that for whatever reason don't feel comfortable in that setting. So that has changed exponentially. This less folks may be less likely to want to engage in person. And I think, in particular, in the case of police reform that's happening nationally, and it even touched me on a very real level here in Tiburon because of an incident we had, there's a lot more focus on policing with equity, right? And being inclusive in how we police. And right, again, people can throw those out as buzzwords, but what do those mean? What does equity look like in policing? And helping again, bringing in the community to help us define that. And what does inclusion look like? There's a lot more focus on who we stop and why we stop them. And to the point of transparency, we're posting more stuff on our transparency on our website than we ever did before because the community expects it. And I think it's important to understand that communities, just like the policing and local governance, they're constantly changing and evolving. And that means that their needs and expectations are constantly changing and evolving. And so we can't, again, judge success on what the needs and expectations was of our community 5 years ago, because right now it looks very different. And I think that that's really important, how we get that information. And it has changed exponentially.
Yeah, that's really very interesting. Thank you. Chief Buckner, can you talk about the strategies that the city's using for actually managing resident expectations? Oh, I'm sorry, Chief, you're on mute.
Again, so from managing expectations, I think that a key piece of this has to be transparency. When the community knows more, they can make informed decisions. They will have informed expectations when they understand what we're doing, why we're doing those things, which is why we are big proponents of sharing information, proactively putting information in the universe that we monthly, quarterly report for the community. The other part of that, with the expectations, again, I go back to the pre-existing relationships. We have citizen advisory groups in our community. The city of Syracuse is broken up into 3 divisions: North, Southwest, and Southeast. And for each of those sections of our city, there's a captain that's 24 hours responsible for that geographical area. When that communication is strong to where the community knows exactly who to go to when they have an issue, those are the kinds of things that I think that make it easy for us to know what the kind of roles and responsibilities that police have and what we're expecting of the community. When we share that information with each other, whether it be information coming up to us from the neighborhood watch organizations or us pushing out information to them, I think that's what kind of keeps the expectations within reason. I think other things like sharing information about your budget. People will see that, the Syracuse Police Department has a $50 million budget. Well, when they have an understanding of that budget, they'll see that 85% of that is salaries, benefits, and pension contributions. So I've got about 10 to 12% of actually operating expenses. So that $50 million is down very, very quickly to see why we're struggling with some of the things that we're struggling with. But when we take the time to explain things or to make sure that the community understands what we're doing, how we operate, I think that helps temper and develop reasonable expectations of what's going on. But the biggest piece of that is sharing of information, because I think that for years, we had this anti-media kind of sentiment, or we didn't want to talk to someone, it was no one business as to what we were doing. And I think because of the lack of trust, particularly in urban communities, that creates this cloud of suspicion and things that we were actually doing a good job, but because we were not illuminating that or sharing that information, it created problems for us. So the one central piece of that, I would say, would be transparency.
Yeah, no, I I totally resonate with that. Just that sharing of information. Have your neighborhood watch groups, how have they evolved over the course of the last couple of years?
Well, the one thing is being able to communicate with this platform. I was very, very pleased and surprised that our neighborhood organizations remained engaged with us because we had a very strong relationship before the pandemic. They continue to meet with us via WebEx or the Zoom platform. So much so, we were so appreciative of that, that when the world semi came back, we had a celebration about a month or so ago to thank them for kind of hanging in there with us during that difficult period. And we had a food catered and fellowship with those organizations to keep that relationship strong. But it certainly has changed in how we interact with each other. But I don't think that the expectations have diminished or changed in the way of what people expect of their police department. We just have to find different ways to communicate.
Yeah, got it. That makes all the sense in the world. Do you celebrate National Night Out, and was it very successful?
We did. It was a very, very good National Night Out, because we had just this year brought a POW program back. So that was a big centerpiece of what we were doing. So we had already ran several of our camps before that. And then to kind of reignite that again, I guess a second launching of that, the youth were very, very well represented in our National Night Out. And we did it in a park that historically had some challenges in the community. And I can't tell you the number of senior citizens that came up to us during that event that appreciated that we could have done National Night Out anywhere in the city, but to take it into a section of the city that has challenges and do something positive, they appreciate that we use that park for something good.
That's well played. Yeah, congratulations on that. Thank you. Chief Monaghan, can you talk about the strategies that you're using for actually helping to manage community expectations? I'm sorry, Ryan, you're on mute.
Yes, probably very similar to a lot of what Commissioner Buckner was just talking about. And the first thing is right messaging, getting that constant communication. I think Chief Buckner said that, you've got the community expects constant communication from you. And it needs to come from you. I think it's really important that they hear the message from you. Now, how you do that is important. I think, in today's day and age, you have to leverage social media. Social media is a huge platform that people communicate on. So we use that platform to get our message out, whether it's to advise our community about potential road construction and traffic delays. We want the community to know about these things and hear it from us, right? So that they can plan ahead. It's also to tell them about good arrests our officers are making, right? The community needs to know that, hey, when they're asleep, that these officers are out there working, keeping them safe. I think it's important to highlight that. It lets the community know that your officers are out there protecting you, and B, it allows us to message the community and provide them. I always want to put a safety message in there. Hey, if we had a burglary, here's things you can do as a community to help us, right? Because safety truly is a partnership. It can't just be the police. It has to be the police in partnership with the community. And we have kind of a unique community because it's fairly affluent, and in some areas of town, these houses are very large, and they don't necessarily know their neighbors because they live out of the area part of the time. And so, again, understanding that for a lot of these folks, social media is where they're getting their information. So leveraging that, and I would say that that's probably more outward communication, because although there is an opportunity for people to communicate back, that's more messaging outward. We also do press releases. We've increased press releases since I've been here, because I think it's important to have that relationship with the press, because they are also an additional conduit for getting out to your community, right? Because not everybody's using social media, especially some of our elderly community. They're still reading the paper, so we want to make sure that we leverage that as well. The other thing we do is town hall meetings. One of the things I've done since I've come here is now we're doing it virtually, but we had a rash of crime in this city that was highly unusual. We had a period of time where we had a lot of home break-ins. A few of those where folks were home and interrupted them, and an armed robbery, which is highly unusual for this community. And I felt it was important for me as the chief to get out there and talk to the community and tell them what we were doing, and also tell them some of the limitations. I think, again, when you talk about managing expectations, it's not like NCIS on TV, right? Where we snap our fingers and we're able to solve the crime in a matter of a couple minutes or a couple days, or, in a 30-minute or a 1-hour episode. So I think that, it's important for the community to hear that, hey, we're going to be working this thing, but also understand that there are going to be some challenges in the investigation. And you know what? Most people understand that when they hear that from you and you explain it. The town halls, though, what I like about those is they allow for that two-way dialogue, right? It allows folks to add in. And I think that's important for people, rather than just the kind of the more outward. And then obviously the last thing, and I think both Chief Workman and Commissioner Buckner have kind of alluded to this. If your officers on the street aren't getting out there and getting the word out and talking to your community, engaging them, all this is for naught, right? You have to create a culture where the officers understand why it's so important. And so I know for me, one of the things I've been really pushing is getting the officers out of their cars. And, especially after coming out of the pandemic, where we were telling them the exact opposite. We were telling them, stay in your cars, don't contact people unnecessarily. And now, as we're kind of trying to roll back out of that, we're making a push, especially in our business districts and some of these other areas that are heavily populated, get those officers out, get them talking to the community, because they're a great conduit for what the community needs are. And again, and getting our messaging out to the community. So I think, if you focus on those three things, that's what's been extremely successful for us, at least right now.
Yeah, that's great. I love your comment about creating the right culture and part of the role that officers have in helping to create that culture. Do you have any tips or any quick advice for folks that have a heavy tourism population in terms of managing tourists' expectations?
Yeah, I think, one thing you have to do is really have a good relationship with your Chamber of Commerce and if you have a tourist organization in town. And I've had extensive meetings with them to understand, what are the things that tourists want to feel like they're safe in town. And so, one of the things that we've been getting positive feedback on, and I just spoke about this, is we've been getting the officers out every shift and getting them out to walk the downtown area. And a lot of the tourists have noticed that and noticed the presence of police officers and appreciate that. And they're sharing that with the community. So I think if you can get your officers out and about in those tourist areas, and whether it's just to provide directions to people, it's a tremendous opportunity for your officers to engage people, while at the same time kind of give them a level of reassurance that they're safe. And I think that that's really important. And, obviously making sure that we're doing what we can to address issues in the areas where there's a lot of tourism, right? Whether it's quality of life issues and maybe not just crime issues, right? It could be trash. It could be all those other things where we work with our other city departments to address it holistically. Because again, at the end of the day, we want that tourism is important. We want folks to want to keep coming here, to feel safe, to enjoy the beauty of what we have to offer. So
that's great advice. Thanks for adding that on. Appreciate that. Chief Workman, can you talk about the strategies that you're using for managing community expectations?
I think Commissioner Buckner and Chief Monaghan really hit a lot of them points on the head with the use of social media. And I guess one of the things that Commissioner Buckner said is it is communication. I think what I'd like to touch to add to what they said is, like, this is not an overnight process. You cannot think that you're going to take these strategies and like tomorrow you're going to be chief of the world and everybody's going to love you. This is a long time. It takes time to build these relationships. It takes time to build that trust so that when that bomb does go off, as Commissioner Buckner said, you don't have the fallout that you would have had if you didn't have those relationships. And that does also start with your officers. You can't be out there. We have a position where you can have 10 officers and 9 of your officers can be fantastic with the community. But if you have that one that just does not make that connection, that's the one that you're going to be dealing with the problems for. So you need to keep those communications not only open with those outside and your community, but with your officers to build that relationship. That's all about relationship building. We can give away all the turkeys we want at Thanksgiving and Christmas. We can go, do whatever we need to do, because we do all that. I mean, we're community oriented people. When you're in a small community, you need to be that. You are the face. You are the one they are coming to, but it's not an overnight process. And you need to be able to not only talk about all those good, feel good things that we're doing, you got to be able to sit down and talk about that guy or that person who ticked off that person they just gave a ticket and they're sitting in your office screaming in your face. And you have to have that. You have to be able to handle those situations also, and handle them with decorum, and handle them with respect, and handle them with restraint, because that's your chance. That's your time to teach people what we deal with as police officers, not when it's all good, not when everything's fun, not when everybody's happy with you, but when the stuff is hitting the fan. And that's the hard part. And you need to realize that that's the building process. So these strategies all work, but you're going to have to do them for a long period of time to gain the trust of those individuals who just don't have that trust in police. And it's not because of you as a person. It could be because of that police officer they dealt with 10, 20 years ago that left a bad taste in their mouth, and you're paying the price for that. But you're the one, and our officers are the ones that have to change that on the street. We're not going to do it without that interaction.
Yeah, that is very well said. In fact, you probably even confront that as a larger challenge than even larger departments, because of your size, when people look at an officer, they're seeing effectively the department, as opposed to a larger organization where you're maybe seeing a division of the department. All of it ties it together. And so I can see you having even those kind of unique special challenges. But your main point about needing to spend time, don't make engagement and building relationships a project. It's got to be an organizational culture. It's got to be something that you just believe in all of the time. And do you have a lot of active neighborhood groups, or how do you kind of structure?
I mean, the way that our town is situated, we're kind of like pockets. I mean, we have pockets of new developments that bring in people from New York, Pennsylvania, or New Jersey. We have pockets that have service people. We have pockets that we have an indigenous tribal organization that's called the Lenape tribe that are still in this area. And while we're not a tribal department, they are still indigenous to this area and live in this area and around this area. So they're all different pockets of people that we do deal with. But I've had 8 years in dealing with all of these groups. So that's kind of made it better. In the beginning, it was not very easy because everybody bombards you. But as they get to know you and you get to know them, that's why I say it's a longer process, that you need to take those different aspects of those groups, kind of like what Chief Monaghan and Chief Buckner said, like where you are. Chief Monaghan has people coming in from different places all the time, like who expect different things. It's kind of the same thing in this community, or even I'm sure in Syracuse, where you have different neighborhoods and different populations, you expect different things. It's a time consuming process, but you have to do it, and you have to do it genuinely. You cannot be a fake. People will see through that in a heartbeat. You need to just genuinely be that person and build that rapport, because it helps you weather those storms when those items happen.
Yeah, very well said. That authenticity is such a critical part of it. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Chief Moynihan, can you talk about the tools and methods that you're using for helping to understand resident expectations in Tiburon, and how you're tracking your performance?
Yeah, no, one of the things that we're looking to be implementing soon, because I do think it's valuable for my previous organization and experience with this, is getting surveys out to the community. I think that's one way to do it. And you have to, there's different ways to do that, right? You can leverage emails and do some of those surveys like that. But again, realizing that not all of your community, uses that or feels comfortable with those types of surveys, maybe even mailers too, to try to get the more robust information. But, I try to keep things simple too. Right now, a lot of times in a small town, and I'm sure, both Commissioner Buckner and Chief Workman get this, right? You have community members sending you emails, whether it's to say that, hey, they didn't like an interaction with an officer, or whether to give kudos. And I think that's really important, right? Because right there is an opportunity to see what's working and what's not working with the community. If you take the time to read those emails and extract what the bottom line is there, right? What was it that they liked? What was it that they didn't like? And then reinforcing that to your staff. So when I'm getting positive feedback, and I just, for example, just got an email the other day about a call for service where my officers took a little extra time and showed a lot of care and compassion with some parents that were experiencing a troubling situation with their child. And the extra time that he took on that call made all the difference in the world. So right there, my community's telling me, that, a lot of these communities, they're telling me, we want your officers to show us care and compassion and spend that extra time. So then, it's me getting that out to the entire department and saying, reinforcing that, hey, this is great job. This is what the community expects from us. You made that contact count. You know, I always tell them, make every single contact count, whether you're pulling someone over to issue a citation, or you're walking down the street with a cup of coffee, or you're going to a call for service. Make it matter and leave a good feeling with that person when they walk away about our police department. And, you know, again, as Chief Workman was saying, right, they've got to get it out there and get that message out there and be the stewards of what you're looking for. So that's one way. And then, you know, social media is also an outlet for us. People do comment. I read all the comments when we post something. People comment on that. And again, to Commissioner Buckner's point and Workman's Chief Workman's point, hey man, they've got to hear from you in the good times. I always say they got to hear from me the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly. They got to hear it from me. And so when you get that information out, for example, about a crime spree where we're telling people, hey, we've had this going on. Here's what we're doing about it. Here's what we need you to do about it. People oftentimes comment on that. And reading those comments is a valuable source of information for you as a police chief and for your organization to ensure that, you know, hey, again, are we aligned with the expectations of this community? So that's another way. And then the last way is something that we're currently doing in a community engagement series. It's creating space for dialogue. And what we've done is I actually brought in a group called the Transformative Justice Institute. That's a local group here, a nonprofit that specializes in mediating community meetings and bringing people together. And the reason why I brought that together and brought them into the fold is because I wanted to make sure that if we had dialogue, if we brought people together, that it'd be meaningful and impactful. And you need people to help guide those discussions, so that it's not just some free-for-all, that you actually have questions and you guide the topic and you put those guardrails in place so that people can speak freely and people can tell us about, hey, what are we not doing so well? You know, one of the questions we ask these people is, hey, that's great. You know, we're getting a lot of positive feedback, but what can we do better? What can we do better? And I think that's really important as well. And in these series, again, we've been including officers. All my staff members are attending these. And so they're hearing firsthand from the community what the community expects, what they think we're doing well, and what we think we can do better. And again, to Chief Workman's point, right, this is just the beginning. This is a work in progress. And it's going to take several years, right, to get the culture shaped around this. It's not an overnight fix. You know, my hope is that by the time I'm ready to leave, at least we're you know, halfway there, and the culture is set in place, and we're getting that robust information. And by that time, you know, the community expectations, again, you got to be nimble, because those expectations are going to change. And so I think that for us, the thing that's been most impactful, Matt, is really creating that space for dialogue. I can't tell you how beneficial it's been for us to have that dialogue, for the community to hear from the officers what the day in the life of an officer is like, and for the officers to hear directly from the community how their actions impact them.
That's very well said. I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that that's a really great point. That has not come up very often in these conversations. And so I'm really glad that that's part of the perspective that you're sharing. Thanks so much for that. Chief Workman, can you share with us some of the tools and methods that you're using for helping to understand resident sentiment?
I think along the lines of Chief Monaghan, I love that idea by Chief Monaghan. So I'm gonna probably be talking to him and taking that one because that is a very good idea right there. But I think if you are not using social media or have someone who knows how to navigate social media in your department, you need to get that person. I mean, social media is such a big key right now in everything that we do. I'm sure that Commissioner Buckner, Chief Monaghan, and myself, we've been around for a pretty fair minute. So we've seen the changes that have come along, but no change like social media has done to affect law enforcement in both a positive and negative way is key. We've talked about a couple things here with the community engagement and a lot with changes and reforms. Small departments across this nation have been changing and making these changes and these reforms before it ever became a hot topic, and they've been able to. because we can, a lot of times, small departments can see that on the forefront through what their community is saying to them because they have that interaction. So if you're not getting out there and telling your people what you are doing, that is your fault. So a lot of the things that came along over the last year and a half and 2 years that legislation is now changing, a lot of small departments have been doing it. And if you've been telling your communities that you've been doing that with body cameras, with changes in your policies, with changes in what you do, if you are not on that from that time, then you solve a problem. But our community, knock on wood, because we've tried to be as upfront and all of our changes and our policy changes and getting body cameras and using social media as that tool, we didn't have a lot of that backlash because they knew we were already doing these kind of things. And it's not just us. I'm sure Chief Monaghan, Chief Buckner, and a lot of departments around this nation, they've been doing this for years and they've made these changes. I mean, me and you, Matt, talked about it shortly prior to this coming on. I mean, things have been changed, but if you need to use that for the right reasons, and you need to get someone who knows how to use it, or have a person in your department who knows how to use social media, knows how to use anything that's available there, to have that dialogue that opens that up. But you also can't just take the good things people say. You got to read into the bad comments that are made also, because they're the ones that are going to tell you what you're truly doing. So that's just kind of the biggest method that we have in taking that, because I think you'll hear more on social media than people will say to your face. So you need to vet it a little bit, and that's why you have to have someone there who can do that. But I think that's one of the biggest ways to understand what kind of an impact you're making on your community.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. Do you have when you start thinking about kind of tracking your department performance, do you have a system in place for collecting data and sharing that data with the public?
One of the things that we've changed, we went to it last year. There's a lot of systems out there. The system that we have now, it's called a Guardian Tracker. You can generate anything that you want with Guardian. I'm not a proponent of it. It's just something that we use. So say we call it response to resistance now. We any discipline, any contact tracing as far as trap, that's all gathered now. We started that about October, November of last year as a trial, and then really kicked off with it in January of this year. And now I'm starting to put a lot of that stuff on our webpage beginning this year and collecting that data, because it's helpful to people to see the things instead of you just telling them. They like to see it. So that's what we've started doing this year, and gathering all that information and putting it out there for the public, because we have nothing to hide, so it's out there.
Yeah, and that's part of building the relationship too, just being transparent with that data. So yeah, great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, sir.
Chief Buckner, can you share with us the tools and strategies that you're finding successful for understanding resident expectations and priorities, and what you're using for tracking your department's performance?
Well, a couple of things that, obviously social media is a big piece for us. When I arrived in 2018, we stood up an office of public affairs. It immediately improved our relationship with the media. We also immediately had the ability to get out our message. Too often, 20 years ago, we were dependent upon the media to tell our story. Well, social media takes that and gives you that power so that we can get that information out. So when in 2018, we had roughly 15,000 people following us on Facebook. Today, we have 36,000. So when you can touch 36,000 people and put the truth in the universe, that's a very, very powerful tool. As far as looking at, how we're performing, crime is obviously a big piece of our report card, and we do that through CompStat. But we also think it's important to have a narrative behind the number, because if people only know the number, but they don't know the narrative, is that, juveniles have slowly become both our victims and suspects in many of our violent crimes, the community needs to know that just behind, the aggravated assault numbers. The other part of that is we look at compliments and complaints, and then what's the theme of the complaint. So, use of force is the thing that makes the news for the national stations when you see where agencies have been excessive in their force. But we found that when looking at our complaints, our number one complaint, or at least the percentage-wise, was demeanor and how the officers talked to the citizen, how they interacted with them. It's not use of force. Less than 1% of our interactions actually involve force. Put that information out there so that people know the truth about use of force, that we rarely use it. But we certainly recognize that we had opportunities for improvement as to how we interact with the community, specifically going to what Chief Monaghan spoke about, to not just this protect and serve mentality, but that this is a customer service business. And these people pay our taxes, they pay our for everything that we have. As I mentioned in one of our graduations for the recruits, treat the citizens in our city like they're responsible for the roof over your head, the food on your table, and the car in your garage. If you treat every encounter in that manner, I promise you, you're less likely to get a demeanor complaint against you, even when that person is not being professional or not what we would have them to be. We need to show that we are the trained professional. So when you look at those kinds of things, increase or decrease in what we're showing with activity with neighborhood watch groups. Of course, we're always looking at use of force, and then Citizens Police Academy, that what I would call that unofficial orientation of policing, so that you can understand how 3 or 4 cars can end up on a traffic stop with an elderly lady who had a tail light out, and you're driving by that, and you may say, well, why did it take 4 cars to stop this 75-year-old woman? Well, the first car saw the tail light out. The second officer came by because he didn't know what he had. Good policing tells you to go by and check on your partner. Officer 3 and 4 were bored and they just drove by to see that. Put that information out there so people can see that, yeah, I saw 4 cars, but the other 2 were really just there standing by waiting for something else to happen, and give that information to people. And so that they understand that until we know what we have, you're going to see police converge on that scene until we can to make some determinations. But all of that is educating the public, and then more importantly, listening to them on the kinds of things that are important from the public sentiment.
Yeah, very well said. And a very great point that people can benefit from, and just understanding why there are so many cars in the neighborhood, for sure. Hey, Chief, do you, with your 3 divisions, do you do much in the way of benchmarking?
What do you mean specifically?
Well, just taking a look at the different issues, comparing what the issues are in Division 1 versus Division 3, and just kind of comparing data to help guide you into your performance.
We do. We just recently had local legislative that did Right to Know as an initiative that we must give citizen upon request or unsolicited. We offer a card that identifies the officer that citizen has been dealing with. If they have a complaint or they have a compliment, they're allowed to be able to know where to deliver that information. It also tells them kind of what their rights are and contact information to get in contact with a citizens review board who can help them through the process if they're interested in lodging a complaint. One of the things that the Right to Know data, and we're just getting ready to put out our first report because we've done it this year, is it shows a disproportionate number of African Americans who have been stopped in our data. Well, if you look at that and just look at it as a number without providing a narrative to that, you can have a lot of misinformed people take that information and do some sinister things with it. Some of it because they're uninformed, some people because they're intentionally trying to be divisive. If you look at where the crime is occurring in our city, and we have, I believe, 12 hotspots in the city. Well, in Southeast, there's 1 hotspot. In our North Division, there are 2. In the Southwest Division, there are 9. So of course, we're going to have more activity where crime is being reported and having more contact with the public because the crime has drawn us to that location because we're an intelligence-led police department. The other part of that is, well, what does the victim information look like in your community? It's also disproportionately Black and brown. And when they're asked to describe who has assaulted them or who has done something to them, more often than not, they describe people that look like them. you have to intelligently get that information to the universe so that people have a complete picture of what you're seeing with your crime. And then also be willing to accept ownership if we have some issues to where we're misstepping or we're doing something wrong in the kinds of complaints that we're receiving. And then we have a thorough process that the community understands and is able to see what happens when they actually lodge a complaint.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing it. That's great information. Appreciate it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your perspectives on all of those different questions. I would love to just kind of open it up and see if there's any additional things that any of you want to share or include or ask questions of each other. Now would be the best time to do that.
Well, the one thing that I will just say, for the universe, and when the people see this, our profession has gone through a significant, challenging period over the past 36 months for something that was already very, very tough. I'll go to my grave saying that the vast majority of police officers, high 90%, are professional, do a great job, and they're here for the right reasons. You ask any chief that we spend 95% of our time on 5% of the police department. The problem that we've seen with our profession being broad brushed is the 95%ers. I think we can do a better job of calling out and holding the 5%ers accountable so that it doesn't look like that certain behavior is acceptable, that certain things that we condone if we don't call those things out. We're always going to have rock throwers at the business because we take life and liberty. So that's very, very controversial. And it's an awesome amount of power that we have. But I do believe that this is still a very noble profession. I still think the vast majority are good people, but certainly we are in a very challenging period, and how we respond to this will determine what the next 20, 25 years is going to look like for our profession, because I truly believe that we're in the middle of a watershedding moment for the profession.
Yeah, very well said. Either of you other gentlemen have any response to that or adding on to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, Commissioner Buckner, it just kind of hit the nail on the head, right? I think as a society right now, right, we see this kind of real schism happening in the nation, right? We're really divided over certain topics, and policing is certainly one of those topics. And I think, you know, one of the things he said that's so important, and it's something that I do, is again, providing context to data. Data is important. People need to see data, but without the context, it can be very easily misconstrued. And so, you know, same thing. We had a situation where folks were saying, well, hey, you know, the majority of the folks that you're stopping were people of color. Okay, so first off, what are the reasons for the stops? And in the vast majority of them for traffic violations, speeding, stop signs, and then being able to provide to the people that, hey, the number one complaint we get in this town is speeding and traffic related stuff, just like most police agencies. So it makes sense that the officers are going to be making a lot of stops. And if you look at it proportionately, they're still stopping. The proportion of Caucasians they're stopping is more proportionate to the town as a whole. And so again, those numbers can be played with, and there are some people that they're not going to like your answer. And it's equally as important to hear what they have to say and why they don't like your answer, what it is that they're focused in on. So, you know, the response here in California, just like everywhere, we're having more legislative changes coming down. So I think it's really important for a chief right now, because you're on that tightrope, right? You have to be able to ensure that you manage the change within your organization and that you help to implement these changes, legislative changes, in a way that folks can digest it and that they're going to go out and do it, as opposed to, oh, this is just some mandate that I got to go out and do, right? We need them to own it with us. They can't just be doing it for compliance reasons. So I think that that's really important, as well as managing those community expectations, right? And I think that you can't lose sight of both. Sometimes it's really easy to be more outwardly focused, because a lot of our job is that, you know, we are that spokesperson for the department, but making sure that you create that equilibrium there where you're also providing that equal focus internally. Because I always say, right, the way that we treat and handle our employees will directly correlates to the way that they're going to go out and treat the public, right? The environment that you set internally dictates how they're going to treat the community. So with all these changes going on, I think it's just so important, and it's easy to lose track of that sometimes. And then certainly to Commissioner Buckner's point of, you know, I'm with Commissioner Buckner. The majority in my 27 years of policing, the majority of folks I've met in this profession are some of the most noble people I've ever met that will literally take the shirt off their back for somebody. I'm fortunate. I have a very dedicated department and a lot of individuals like that. However, when you do get that small percentage, I think not only the community expects you to take action, but the rest of the officers do. And that's how you set culture. You can't, whatever you tolerate becomes the norm, right? So, but thank you. Again, thank you for your time and including me in this, Matt. And I've learned a lot from both Chief Workman and Commissioner Buckner. And I foresee me sending both these gentlemen emails to ask some questions about some of the things they're doing, especially in terms of, I know Commissioner Buckner talked about CALIA. I think that's a great idea. The more that you can have some kind of something you can point to say, this is a national standard and we met this standard. So these are things that I'll be looking at personally as I move forward.
Yeah, well, thanks. Chief Workman, I want to make sure you get an opportunity to pitch in if you want.
I just wanted to thank both Chief Buckner and Chief Monaghan. I learned a lot. I think to end that point with both gentlemen said, I think with the reforms that we see and the things that we have come along, that we have more police chiefs like these two gentlemen across this nation, that you will see the change starts with us and in our departments, and that 5% will be gone as this moves through. It's just a time-consuming effort, but as long as departments realize that and continue to do what they are starting to do now, I think that 5% will weed itself out, and you'll have more departments that are holding their I don't want to say undesirables, but their sub officers to a higher standard. Will either change that officer or change that or drive that officer out of the profession, and keep us and all the police officers that are in this nation held to that high regard that most of them do. So I want to thank you all for this opportunity. Again, I also learned a lot, and I look forward to keeping in touch with Commissioner Buckner and Chief Monaghan as the time goes forward.
Let me just kind of wrap this up. Thank all of you for sharing that. That was a great add-on. This has been just a really outstanding panel with great insights and great perspectives. You know, the whole notion of having a system in place, whether it's through accreditation or having a public information officer so that you can tell your own story and make sure that the truth is coming out. I think those are all just critical things. I love the notion and the way that you all talked about the time it takes to build trust and the role that transparency and communication, authentic communication plays into those mechanisms. Your organization and your community structure is going to help determine what kind of engagements and the methods for those engagements. But it's very clear that all of you put a high priority on that engagement aspect and are doing it in a whole variety of different ways, even with all of the challenging things that are in front of us. I also, Ryan, I really appreciate you starting to talk about the internal environment, because just given all the officers that are leaving the profession because of all of the challenges, paying attention to that internal environment is such an important aspect. So many great things, the use of technology and the work that you do and the importance of those face-to-face, all of those points that all of you have brought up have been just really outstanding. And so thank you very much for that. So here's what I'm going to do in just kind of closing this out. I am going to give you contact information for each other. I will send out an email later today, so you'll have all of that information. I do these panels every week, so I welcome you to suggest other people that might be good or might have an interest in sharing perspectives, or maybe they've got a unique story to tell that you think others would benefit from. Pass them on my way, and I'll try to get them scheduled into this program. You'll start seeing the video links for these highlight segments on LinkedIn probably within a week, and share them throughout your network. I really try to stress the value that people who respect your opinions will benefit from those conversations. And so share it with whoever is in your LinkedIn network, and help other departments benefit from the examples that you're doing. The benefit for me is I get to meet three cool guys every week, and today was no exception. It really was just a great conversation, and I really found I learned a lot myself today. And as a city manager, I continue to hold police chiefs and people in law enforcement with the highest level of respect for the work that you're doing and kind of working through this really challenging time. So thanks again for spending time today with me. And I will look forward. I'll connect with you. I'd love to get some feedback on how this went for you. So think about what I might do differently to improve these series of conversations. I'm all ears and open to any ideas that you think can make it work a little bit better. I hopefully will see you and meet you down in New Orleans next week or within the next couple of weeks. So hopefully we can meet in person. But in the meantime, best of luck with everything you're doing.